Most people imagine the brothers of Jesus as immediate disciples, converted since childhood, privileged witnesses to the divine that surrounded them at home. The truth is something else entirely. What actually unfolded in James's life demanded a painful inner turning, years of silent disbelief, and an encounter after the cross that rewrote everything. This is the story you were never told. James was not just any name in that house in Nazareth. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verse 55, records his name first among the Lord's brothers, before Joseph, before Simon, before Judas. And yet, for practically the entire span of Jesus' public ministry, he remained on the outside of faith. John, chapter 7, verse 5, states it plainly, not even his brothers believed in him. James was among those brothers, and that disbelief carries a weight that few people pause to measure. Put it in perspective. You shared the same table for approximately 30 years. You watched your older brother cut wood in your father's workshop. You witnessed his growth at age 12 when he stayed behind in the temple speaking with the doctors of the law. You heard his words every morning, observed every daily gesture, broke bread at the same meal each evening. And still, when the first miracles began to happen outside Nazareth, you did not believe. Think about what that means. It is not that James was hostile at heart. It is not that he harbored hatred for his brother. It is that familiarity had built an invisible wall, thick, nearly impenetrable. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verse 3, captures the exact moment when the neighborhood of Nazareth, including the family, is scandalized. How could that carpenter, son of Mary, brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon be the promised Messiah? The question that paralyzed the town also paralyzed the brothers of his own blood. Silence. That was the first cost of James's story, not the martyrdom that would come decades later. It was the cost of having the Messiah living under the same roof and failing to recognize him, of hearing the most transformative teachings in human history delivered by your own flesh and blood brother, and dismissing all of it as an embarrassing delusion. Ancient commentators, such as Hegesippus, preserved in the writings of Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century, record that James spent years overcoming that mental barrier. Years. But what actually broke through that wall has yet to be revealed, and what has yet to be revealed is how that same man, years later, would have knees as calloused as a camel's from praying so long for the people he once ignored. Follow the process. James's turning point did not happen during the ministry. It did not happen at the Last Supper. It did not happen at Calvary. The Gospels do not record James at the foot of the cross. Those who were there were John, the beloved disciple, and Mary, the mother of the Lord. The brothers of his blood, according to the silence of the narratives, did not appear on that Roman hill covered in blood and cries. And that silence says a great deal. The precise moment of the turning is recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 7. Paul, listing the appearances of the risen Christ, writes a short and devastating line. Then he appeared to James. That is all. No details, no preserved dialogue, no described setting. But the impact of that appearance was total. It was enough to transform the unbelieving brother into the most respected leader of the primitive church in Jerusalem. Imagine the weight of that encounter. The brother who had been crucified, buried, given up for dead, now standing before you, alive, flesh, voice, a recognizable gaze. James needed nothing more. 3 decades of disbelief collapsed in that instant, like a dry brick wall before an earthquake. And there began the second half of his life, a life that would end with stones, shouts, and a fall from the height of the temple. Consider the environment into which James stepped as a leader. Jerusalem, from the 30s to 62 after Christ, a seething city with a population estimated between 80,000 and 120,000 in ordinary times. Swelling to nearly 1 million, during the three great annual feasts, according to calculations by historian Joachim Jeremias, based on the accounts of Flavius Josephus. The nascent church grew amid violent religious tensions, intermittent persecutions, and constant Roman political surveillance. This was the city James would need to shepherd. Acts of the Apostles, chapter 12, verse 17, records the moment when Peter, miraculously freed from Herod Agrippa, the first's prison around the year 44 after Christ, sends word specifically to James. Not to just any apostle, to James. This indicates that he was already a central figure, perhaps even the primary human authority of the community in Jerusalem at that point, and the church was growing fast. Acts chapter 2 speaks of 3,000 converts in a single day, following Peter's sermon at Pentecost. Acts chapter 4 says the number of male converts reached approximately 5,000, not counting women and children. Within a few years, the Christian community in Jerusalem likely numbered 15 to 20,000 members, spread across households, with no temples of their own, living in community of goods and pressed on all sides. From the outside, it looked like a marginal religious movement, one among dozens of messianic sects that rose and fell in the Judea of that century. From the inside, it was the greatest spiritual transformation in human history, gestating among craftsmen, fishermen, converted Pharisees, and former tax collectors. The weight fell on James, and he carried it. Consider the magnitude of the Council of Jerusalem. Around the year 49 after Christ, a controversy threatened to split the church into two irreconcilable currents. The question was simple and devastating. Did Gentile converts need to be circumcised and fully observe the Mosaic law? On one side, Jewish Christians coming from the Pharisaic tradition, defending complete ritual continuity. On the other, Paul and Barnabas, returning from their mission among the Gentiles of Asia Minor, defending salvation by faith without the yoke of the law. In the middle, holding the fragile balance of everything, James. Acts 15 documents what happened. Peter spoke first, recalling the conversion of Cornelius. Paul and Barnabas reported the signs and wonders among the Gentiles, and then James took the final word, citing the prophet Amos and offering the practical solution. His decision shaped Christianity forever. The Gentiles would not need to be circumcised. They only needed to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from animals that had been strangled, and from blood. 4 requirements, only 4. Because of that decision, Christianity ceased to be a restricted Jewish sect and opened itself to the furthest reaches of the Roman Empire. No engineer calculated the impact of that. No military strategist foresaw it. It was a pastoral decision made by a man who, 3 decades earlier, had considered his own brother a madman. But James's life in Jerusalem was not simply a matter of managing assemblies and mediating doctrinal disputes. Hegesippus, quoted by Eusebius in Book 2 of the Ecclesiastical History, chapter 23, describes his daily routine in detail that borders on the supernatural. James entered the temple alone. He wore linen garments, not wool. He drank no wine or fermented drink. He cut neither his hair nor his beard. He used no sandals anointed with perfumed oil. He did not visit the public baths. He spent so much time kneeling in prayer, interceding for the people, that his knees became calloused like a camel's. A camel. Hold that image for a moment. Camel's knees. This is not poetic metaphor. It is a concrete anatomical description. Thickened skin, dense calluses, joints deformed by the constant position of pressing against hard stone, years and years kneeling on the temple floor, begging forgiveness for the people, begging mercy for the city that was on the verge of stumbling into suicidal war against Rome. And the people called him James the Just, and also Oblius, a word that, according to Hegesippus, meant something like bulwark of the people. He was the one who spiritually held together the integrity of a city about to collapse. Measure the magnitude of what he carried. Jerusalem was living under growing tension at alarming proportions. The Zealots preached armed revolt against Rome. The Sicarii assassinated collaborators in broad daylight, hiding short daggers under their cloaks. The Sadducees controlled the priesthood with an iron grip and a political alliance with Rome. The Pharisees competed for religious authority in the synagogues. The factions multiplied like cracks in a wall about to give way. And among the primitive Christians, intermittent persecutions since the death of Stephen in the year 34 after Christ, passing through the execution of James, son of Zebedee, at the hands of Herod Agrippa I around 44. James, the brother of the Lord, was still alive. And he remained alive while other apostles dispersed on distant missions, while Peter traveled between Antioch and Rome, while Paul wrote letters from the prisons of Macedonia and Rome. For nearly 3 decades after the resurrection, James stood firm in Jerusalem, seated in the chair of leadership, withstanding pressures from every side, mediating, interceding, writing. Inwardly, he was a bridge between Jews and Gentiles, between Mosaic tradition and Christian revelation, between law and grace, between those most zealous for circumcision and those most freed from it. Outwardly, he was a growing target. The more the church expanded, the more the Sadducean priestly establishment felt the political and economic threat. Look at what he wrote. The Epistle of James, considered by many scholars one of the oldest letters in the New Testament, possibly written between 45 and 50 after Christ, contains 108 verses divided into 5 chapters, and not a trace of elaborate Greek erudition, just short, practical, rough-edged sentences about faith without works, about the tongue that sets forests ablaze, about the patience of Job, about the effective prayer of a righteous man, about wealth that rots and workers who have been robbed. It is a manual of Christian living written by someone who lived the faith with his entire body. But what made that manual so peculiar has yet to be revealed. And it remains to be understood why that letter nearly failed to enter the canon in the first centuries of institutional Christianity. Follow the detail. James writes to dispersed brothers from the 12 tribes, indicating a predominantly Jewish Christian audience scattered across the empire. He does not mention Jesus by name more than twice in the entire letter. He does not focus on elaborated theological doctrines, as Paul does in Romans. He focuses on conduct, on concrete justice, on care for the poor, the orphan, the widow, on control of the tongue, on daily practical purity. It is as though he were continuing the Sermon on the Mount in his own words, in direct and cutting prose. And it makes perfect sense. He grew up hearing those teachings long before he ever believed them. The contrast is brutal. For 3 decades he did not believe, and when he came to believe, he wrote one of the most practical and demanding letters in all of Scripture. But his time was running out, and the city he had tried to sustain through constant prayer was walking toward disaster. Examine the details of that fatal year, 62 after Christ. The Roman procurator Porcius Festus, who had dealt with Jewish religious affairs with relative moderation, dies suddenly at his post. The new procurator, Lucius Albinus, is still on his way to Jerusalem, traveling the eastern route of the empire. There is a power vacuum, and into that vacuum, the high priest Ananus II, son of the Annas who appears in the Gospels, sees the political opportunity he had been waiting for. Flavius Josephus, in Book 20 of Jewish Antiquities, Chapter 9, Paragraph 1, records what happened in chilling detail. Ananus II was a Sadducee of aristocratic lineage, known for a severe temperament and religious ambition. He hastily convened a Sanhedrin without Roman authorization. He brought James, the brother of Jesus who was called the Christ, along with other accused men. He pronounced against them the sentence of transgressors of the law, and he delivered them to be stoned. Hegesippus adds more brutal details. According to the tradition preserved by Eusebius, the scribes and Pharisees brought James up to the pinnacle of the temple during a feast, possibly Passover, with the crowd of pilgrims packed into the courtyard below. They demanded that he publicly renounce Jesus before that mass of people. They expected that, hearing the renunciation from the most respected man in Jerusalem, the people would abandon faith in Christ. Instead, James proclaimed in a loud voice that Jesus was seated at the right hand of the power and would return on the clouds of heaven, repeating the very confession Christ himself had made before Caiaphas 30 years earlier. The crowd began to acclaim him, and Ananus II fell into desperation. The executioners pushed James from the top of the temple's pinnacle. Modern archaeological estimates, based on reconstructions of Herod's temple by specialists such as Leon Rittmeyer, calculate that the pinnacle could reach between 40 and 50 meters in height at the southeastern corner, depending on the exact location of the fall. 40 to 50 meters. More than a modern 15-story building, James fell, and he did not die immediately. Think about that moment. The body shattered against the stones of the lower courtyard, bones fractured, unimaginable pain, blood flowing from internal wounds. Hegesippus records that he still knelt down, those calloused knees, one more time, and prayed for his own executioners. He asked God's forgiveness, for they did not know what they were doing. It was the prayer of Jesus on the cross, repeated by the brother who had taken so many years to recognize who his brother truly was. The prayer echoed through human history as a faithful reverberation. And then the stoning began. Stones hurled at a man already fallen, bleeding, praying, the crowd around him trying to stop the massacre. A priest from the family of Rechab crying out that it was a mistake, that the Just One was praying for everyone. A fuller, in the end, seized one of the wooden clubs he used in his trade of beating cloth and delivered the final blow to James's head. Silence. James the Just, brother of Jesus, leader of the Jerusalem church for approximately 3 decades, author of one of the most practical epistles in the New Testament, mediator of the council that opened Christianity to the world, died on the ground, close to the temple where he had prayed his entire life. His blood, according to the tradition preserved by Hegesippus, ran down the stone steps, and it did not end there. Flavius Josephus records that many moderate Jews in Jerusalem were horrified by the execution. They considered the act a grave transgression by Ananus II himself, who had acted without Roman authorization and outside the legal limits of the Sanhedrin under occupation. They sent delegations to the new procurator Albinus and to King Agrippa II. As a direct political consequence, Ananus was removed from the high priesthood after only 3 months in office. Only 3 months. A lightning fall for a powerful priestly family. But the spiritual damage was done. The Jerusalem church had lost the human pillar that had sustained it, and less than 8 years later, what James had tried to prevent through his constant prayers was realized. In the year 70 after Christ, the Roman legions commanded by Titus besieged Jerusalem. 5 months of relentless siege, devastating famine inside the walls, with mothers resorting to cannibalism, according to Josephus himself. Around 1 million dead, according to the estimates recorded in the Jewish war. The temple was destroyed. The stones were torn down to the last, just as Jesus had prophesied in Matthew 24. And the Christians of Jerusalem, instructed by ancient warnings from Christ himself, fled to Pella in the Decapolis before the final siege closed in. Eusebius records this exodus in the Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 5. They survived. The seed planted by James, even without its visible pillar, passed through the destruction of the holy city and spread to the east, to the north, and to the west. And the story does not stop here. Consider James's legacy centuries later. The epistle he wrote nearly failed to enter the canon. Luther, in the 16th century, went so far as to call it an epistle of straw because of its emphasis on practical works at the expense of soteriological discussion. But the Church, across the centuries, kept it. And today, those 5 pages continue to be read by billions of Christians in more than 2,000 translations into different languages around the world. Billions. From a man who spent 3 decades refusing to believe in his own brother. James did not see the fall of Jerusalem. He did not see Christianity spread across the Roman Empire. He did not see Constantine, centuries later, make the Christian faith the imperial religion. He did not see the cathedrals raised in his name in lands he never imagined existed. He did not see entire libraries written about his brief epistle. He did not see the theological debate between faith and works shape entire movements of Christian history, from the Protestant Reformation to the Council of Trent. He acted without seeing the result, and perhaps that is the most documentary lesson his life offers. His initial disbelief did not disqualify him. The familiarity with the sacred, which nearly blinded him forever, was transformed into one of the most profound devotions of the primitive church. The man who looked at his brother and saw nothing divine became the man whose knees, calloused as a beast of burdens, marked the floor of the temple from so much interceding for the people. James's visible failure, his prolonged disbelief, his brutal death on stone steps, were, according to the fabric of history, the mechanism of something more enduring than any human construction. A letter that crossed 20 centuries. A church that survived the destruction of its own mother city. A concrete demonstration that faith can be born late and still burn higher than the faith of those who never doubted. James would not have known, as he ascended the pinnacle of the temple in the year 62 after Christ, that would be the last visible act of a life whose echo would travel 2,000 years to reach the words you are hearing right now. He would not have known that his shattered body, thrown from the temple steps, would be recounted in every language of the world, in more than 7,000 languages spoken by humanity. He would not have known that 2 millennia later, someone would be reflecting on what it means to have the Messiah living at home and fail to recognize him, and what it means, after recognizing him, to give everything down to the very last drop of blood spilled upon the stone. The tragic life of James, brother of Jesus, is the story of a turning that came late but arrived whole. And when it came, it did not retreat a single inch. Even as the stones began to fall upon the body of the one who for 3 decades had been nothing more than a brother among brothers, and who became in the end the bulwark of an entire people.